Today, we're going to be building a vintage Socket 5 Pentium 75 computer. Let's get started. Let's first start by taking a look at the parts I'll be using in this system, starting with the CPU. This is an Intel Pentium SX961 Pentium 75. It was originally released in 1994 and was the second type of Pentium CPU ever made. This is a really cool CPU and should run the majority of DOS games just great, and it also has a really nice gold cap on it, so this should be a great choice. Let's take a look at the video card next, which is a Tseng Labs ET4000 PCI. And this is a really nice card which would be perfectly suited for this era of computer. It's a really late model one, so it should be pretty fast. It's featuring 1MB of RAM, which is actually upgraded since it would have only come with 512K on the factory. Next, we have the sound card, which is a Sound Blaster OR64. This is a pretty stock standard sound card which was actually released in 1996, though it's very similar to the OR32 which was released in 1994. So I'll make an exception to the period correctness in this build, simply because it's what I have on hand. As we can see, it's very shiny, so it should go great in this system. Next, we have a SCSI controller. But not just any SCSI controller, this one. I don't know what brand this thing is, but the only identification on it is the model number, which is DC800. It's got a lot of options and is allegedly a really fast SCSI card, so hopefully it should go well with some external peripherals which I intend on using with this system. Next, we have the motherboard, which is a Gigabyte one. This appears to be a very early Socket 5 motherboard, and one which I can't find anything about online. It's very interesting since it's missing a lot of features, like any onboard controllers, and it also has really old style cache modules. Now, you might be wondering, how do you actually plug anything into this board? And the answer's simple, with this. Here we have the controller card, which Gigabyte actually sold just for this motherboard. It's a PCI one, so it's a lot faster than the more common ISA ones, and this should work perfectly and give us all the necessary ports. And last but not least, we have a 3-COM PCI network card, specifically the Etherlink 3 PCI model. This has a lot of ports on the back, so it should be pretty interesting, but the one I'm going to use primarily is definitely Ethernet. Let's begin building the computer by first installing the CPU. It's rather easy in these sockets since you just pull the retention arm back and insert the CPU carefully. Doesn't that look awesome in this motherboard? Next, I'll install a CPU cooler, and I'll go with this generic one here. This should be more than enough to keep the Pentium 75 cool. Now, I was going to install this cooler, but as you can see, these resistor packs here actually stop you from using the retention arm on this socket. That's a terrible design right there, so clearly we're going to need to come up with a solution. First of all though, I'll apply some thermal paste to the CPU, just to make sure it stays cool. I came up with a solution to mount the cooler effectively. I'm just going to simply stick a cable tie underneath these retention arm holders here. Now, this is a pretty dodgy way of doing it, but actually once I got it done, it turned out fine. And yeah, that looks like it'll work perfect. So this motherboard can support 3 types of Pentium CPUs, 75MHz, 90MHz and 100MHz models. And that means the jumpers are really simple to configure, since there's only 3 choices of CPUs. So I had to adjust them here. It seems this board would have previously had a Pentium 90 installed, but now it's set to the 75. I'm going to install the RAM next, and I've gone with 16MB. Now these sticks actually didn't end up working. I'm pretty sure this board only supports FPM modules, whilst these are EDO. It took me a while to figure it out, but I got it working with some RAM eventually, so it ended up being 16 megabytes. As for the case, I'll be using this mini AT tower, which you might recognise from a previous video. I think this computer case perfectly suits the era of computer I'm aiming to build here, so it should be perfect. Turning it around and lifting the lid off, as we can see, it's filthy inside, so I'm gonna go clean it up real quick. That's looking a whole lot better. It's more suitable now. Okay, so now we need to turn the case around and remove the motherboard tray so we can install the motherboard easier. It's a pretty tight fit in this case, so this will make it way better. After installing the plastic standoffs onto the motherboard, as we can see, it's really easy to go ahead and place it on the motherboard tray and then slide it in. We only need to install 2 screws just to keep the motherboard in place. Now we can install the motherboard in its tray back into the case. This makes it a lot easier rather than trying to squeeze it into the case, so yeah, I prefer to do it this way with AT cases. And there we go, nicely done. Now we need to plug the fan from the CPU into the power supply. This is rather simple since it uses Molex. Then we can line up the AT power connectors and remember to place them black to black, cause red to red and you're dead. Then we just plug them into the motherboard. Next, I'll wire up the case's front I/O. This is a rather easy task when you're dealing with good quality hardware, since the legends on the board make it easy to plug everything in. I'm going to install a 5¼ inch floppy drive into this PC, but it's a very late model one, which looks quite stylish indeed. We need to sort out our controller card now, and I've got a bunch of cables which should hopefully connect to it. I'll plug in the floppy, serial, and then the IDE cable. Alrighty, that looks good. Now we can install it into the motherboard, and I'll use the top PCI slot. I read somewhere that it has a different IRQ or something. I'm not entirely sure on this, but it goes in the top PCI slot either way. Now it's time to plug in the power connector, as well as the floppy connector to the 5¼ inch floppy drive. Then I'll also plug in the 3½ inch one. Now I'm going to install this giant SCSI card. Now, this was a real challenge to get in the PC, so I've just skipped over it here, and here's me putting the screw in. Now we're going to install the Tsang Labs ET4000 graphics card. It'll fit perfectly with this PC, and I'm really glad I went with this card. Now it's time to install the Sound Blaster OR64. This is going to be a great sound card for this computer. Now it's time to install the 3Com Etherlink 3 into the system. This is going to be a great networking card and should last a really long time since 3Com make really good. Now I'm going to install this Seagate 2GB hard drive, and I've already preloaded it with Windows 3.1 and DOS, so it should be ready to go. Then I'll just simply install it into the case as shown here. And just a quick side note before we move on, I had to do a modification to the Dallas RTC chip to make it use a standard CR2032 battery. The computer wouldn't boot into the operating system without it. Now we just need to install a lid onto the case, and once that's done, the computer is basically completed, which is really nice. I've now got the computer set up, so it's time to adjust all the settings in the BIOS. Now let's boot into Windows 3.1 and have some fun with some games and MIDI music. Well, that's about it for this video. I really hope you enjoyed this build, and I'll see you next time.